What's up, everybody, and welcome back to an old series that some of you might remember, but one I haven't done in a while. But this is called Wolf's Ramblings. And if you're new to the channel, if you haven't ever seen one of these before, it's basically me talking about something with no gameplay, sort of basically like the podcast without it's just me. So it's a just me podcast. How about that? But anyway, so there's going to be no gameplay. It's just going to be me talking about something for probably 30-ish minutes. But anyway, enough with the intros. This time, though, as opposed to remember some of the last ones, I kind of forget what I'm talking about, or I can't remember what I wanted to say. But this time I wrote some stuff down, have some notes, so I won't forget and I won't stumble along as badly as I did in the last couple ones. But anyway, we're going to go back to Zelda for the third time now. So get in your Zelda mode if you aren't already. That sounded really dumb. Anyway. But I've already talked about Skyward Sword, and I've talked about all the other Zeldas, but now I want to talk about the next Zelda, because it's actually just, Nintendo just now hinted at the next Zelda in a video where they talked about the Wind Waker HD remake, which looks really cool. I don't mind that at all. You know, quick little remake, just like Ocarina of Time 3DS, make Wind Waker look nicer. No problem with that at all. Wind Waker, it's weird though, because Wind Waker already probably looks the nicest out of all the games. Even though the art style is pretty specific, it still looks the best in today's standards because it aged really well. But whatever they want to do, I guess if they want to make it HD, go ahead. No problem. I wonder how it's going to look. I saw some screenshots, but I wonder how it's actually going to play out in HD because I guess it already looks great. Yeah, I know they might actually end up ruining it, but that's not what this is about. Why am I talking about that? Anyway, in the same video that they talked about Wind Waker, they also talked about the next Zelda, and they said some things that kind of scared the ever-living shit out of me about it, but that probably is for a whole other video. They mentioned the word, or they didn't say the word, but they hinted towards multiplayer, and I had a long argument with the guys about that, but that's for a whole other video. Multiplayer Zelda, Jesus Christ. Yeah, I want to talk about it, but then again, I want this video to be not about that because I might get all ranty, and I don't want to get all ranty, so I'll leave that for some other time. But anyway, the next Zelda, They talked about leaving convention behind, like not following the same pattern they always do. And that's both a good thing. It's a good thing up to a point. Like, Zelda is nice because it's so conventional. And it follows patterns that are enjoyable and don't necessarily need to be changed. But if they were, you need to be careful if you're going to change them. Because, you change them the wrong way, they're going to suck. There's a reason Zelda's worked out for as long as it has, because everything about it is just perfect. I mean, doing the same thing over again isn't necessarily copying the last game as opposed to just continuing a formula that's worked. But I think they can improve on the formula and change it in certain ways. That would be for the better. And I'm going to list some things out right now. The big one, or one of the big ones, is dungeons. Dungeons in Zelda games they've been really nice. Skyward Sword and Wind Waker, they weren't very... Wind Waker, they were okay. But in Skyward Sword, besides the Ancient Cistern and the pirate ship, they were very they were very average. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not even close to a good thing. It's I'll redact that statement. It was a bad thing. Because dungeons are like, I don't want to throw a random percent out there and just bullshit it, but dungeons are a pretty big aspect of Zelda games. I don't know. I don't know what percent of the game they are on average, because that's math that I don't want to do. It'll take a long time. But they're a good chunk of the game's of the gameplay. So they're very important, just in a time manner, in that you're spending a lot of time in dungeons, a lot of time in dungeons. So just even in that aspect, they're important. But even then, like that's what people remember probably when they look at Zelda games, is they remember the dungeons and the bosses of the dungeons. They don't usually remember the in-between parts. Unless they're story elements, but you don't remember walking from point A to point B, or from dungeon to dungeon, besides maybe some story points here and there. So really the main focus is your dungeons. And, in Skyward Sword, one of the big problems was the dungeons couldn't really tell them apart from each other. I mean, you could, but less so than other Zelda games. Like, in Ocarina of Time, you had the first three dungeons, which were the Deku Tree. You're inside a giant tree. You had the Dodongo Caverns, which was a bunch of caves. And then you had inside a fucking giant fish's belly, one of the coolest dungeons in Zelda, the Jabba Jabba's belly. 3 very distinct dungeons to start out. And then they moved on to the next dungeons, the next dungeon grouping, which had the forest temple, which was a temple ruin in the forest thing. It had the fire temple, which was inside a volcano, in an ancient like Goron shrine inside of a giant volcano. And you had the water temple, which was exactly what it sounds like, a water temple underneath a lake inside of a... I don't know exactly what was the purpose of the water temple. Did they ever explain? That's something I have to look into, but I don't really they explain the purpose of the water temple. But anyway, and then the spirit temple, which was a deserty, ancient, Gerudo play. It was distinct. I'm trying to find right words and I can't find them, but... And then finally you had the Shadow Temple, which was another really good dungeon, a dark place filled with dead people. Scary place. And they were all very, very distinct and very memorable because they were not large, but they felt large. Like, the rooms weren't necessarily gigantic or anything, but they felt like they were, and they felt like you were actually on an epic, or in an epic place, like inside a volcano, underneath a lake. All those things I just listed. Even the first 3 dungeons, which were, generally minor dungeons in hindsight because they were the easier ones, but you're inside a giant talking tree, and then, inside a fucking fish, which again, I'm just bringing that one up again. That was awesome. So, that's Ocarina of Time. They had a great feel. Twilight Princess also had great dungeons in a similar aspect to Ocarina of Time, that they were very distinct. I think, I'm trying to remember all the dungeons. Well, I haven't played Twilight Princess in a while, but you had the forest temple to start, then you had the Goron mines, and then you had the water temple. Actually, exactly the same as Ocarina of Time. A lot of people say Twilight Princess is too much like Ocarina of Time, but that's probably a whole other argument. I don't want to get into that. But then it had the Arbiter Grounds, and the Ice Yeti mansion. That was an awesome dungeon. Very weird, different dungeon. Probably one of the best examples of Nintendo going a little off the tracks, even though they barely went off the tracks, but that it still represents a slight shift in what a dungeon can be. There was another one that does that, but I can't remember exactly what it is. Maybe the ship from the pirate ship from Skyward Sword. Maybe that was sort of off the rails a little bit. But again, Twilight Princess, distinct dungeons. You really couldn't... You could easily tell them all apart. But Skyward Sword had the Earth Temple and the Fire Temple literally look exactly the same. The same art style, same enemies, same... It looked the same. That was the whole problem with Skyward Sword, is that the art style made everything look so similar. It was all blurry and just everything blurred together. And the dungeons were so poorly designed. I guess they weren't poorly designed in a puzzle manner, but they were poorly designed in an art manner, and the puzzles didn't add enough to make up for it. And so the dungeons felt very average, and they didn't feel epic, and they didn't feel exciting. And that's what the next Zelda game, I think, needs to improve on even farther than the older games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Now this will lead into my next point, but now that we have the Wii U, which has HD, you could pick your own art style for whatever. I mean, that's what the beauty of Zelda is. It doesn't have a defined art style. You have Wind Waker, you have Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, all distinct art styles from each other. Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time are the same, but that's just because of the same engine. But it's very distinct, and there's no one that defines the entire series. So that gives the artist a lot of freedom to pick an art style. This is something that Matthew Matosis mentions in this video, but it gives the artists the freedom to pick an art style that matches the game itself, which would be really... It's nice, imagine if you're programming a game and it has to be, you already have the art style from the previous games, you're making a sequel, but you want to take it a slightly different route in terms of story. If the story is more lighthearted or more dark, like a Sonic game, if you wanted a really dark Sonic game, you really couldn't probably do it because it's so cartoony and goofy. You really wouldn't be able to make it dark at all. That's what I mean. Because Sonic has such a definable art style, you can't really do anything. That's what's nice about Zelda, that you don't have that. And so, in the next game, they need to pick an art style that would suit epic style dungeons, and that more, again, akin to what we saw in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Just giant large-scale dungeons that are themed even more, and also like unconventional, like the mansion in Twilight Princess, but even more so, like the dungeons in Zelda always go by the same formula, in that you go through the dungeon, you find an item, you go through the rest of the dungeon, and you fight the boss. Maybe let's change that even just take a slight change from it. And I wouldn't be able to. I'd have to think about it for a long time if I wanted to tell you something that you could do exactly. But just change that up. And make the dungeon just, again, I don't know. Take a risk. Take one risk with one dungeon, and if you fuck it up, don't worry. There's still 7 or 8 other dungeons that will be the same if you want to go that route. Take one risk. Take 2 risks even, because there's so many dungeons. You have on average like 8 or 9 dungeons. So take a risk with a couple and see what you can do. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But that's no problem, because the old dungeon way is fine. It's beautiful. It's perfect. So, they have a chance to take a risk. They need to take that chance. Yeah. Well, I'm going to move on to where I was talking about the art design. I'd like to see a more realistic art design, more akin to Twilight Princess. Just because the Skyward Sword one didn't work for me. It didn't at all. I mean, it looked nice. It was visually appealing, but it didn't fit the game, and it got too similar at times. It was always blurry. Like, I guess that's what it was supposed to be, as an impressionist style art, but I don't think it ever worked the way it was intended to work. And again, it didn't look bad. It looked fine, but it never meshed together well with the game itself. And that's why I think they need to try a little harder to make a different, just go all out, go totally different. Just like Wind Waker. Try something different. I don't think you should go for hyper realism, because that's pointless and takes way too much time. Go for something different. The artists have their freedom. Let them do what they want to do. I'm going to be really disappointed if they repeat the art style from Skyward Sword. I'm going to be very, very disappointed if I see the same exact art style. I mean, I'll be slightly happy in knowing that they won't have to design it and they'll have more time to do other things, but that's the only perk to that. Again, it's just because this leads into another point I want to make, is that I want the game to be darker. And I know everyone and their fucking mother says that about Zelda games because how good Majora's Mask story was, but the game just needs to. I don't think cutesy fits modern Zelda. I mean, it worked for Wind Waker perfectly. Like again, but that's because of the art style as well in that game. But I don't think Skyward Sword tried to do. I don't know what Skyward Sword tried to do actually. That's the problem. Is I don't know if it was trying to be dark. I don't know if it was trying to be happy. It was a happy game, but the art style didn't really reflect that 100%. And it always felt like it was in the middle and didn't know what it wanted to be. And that kind of ruined it a little bit. It didn't have a theme to it, so it couldn't be enjoyed as much as it probably could have been. Like when you look at Twilight Princess, the art style was more realistic and more working around the Twilight realm, in that it was supposed to be strange and off-putting in a good way, and that's what they did, and it worked. And it worked really well. Same thing with Wind Waker, in that, again, they made it really cartoony and happy, and the game was always happy, and it had its dark moments, but it was always a feel-good kind of game, and that's worked. So I'd like to see a darker game that has a darker art style, or even just a more realistic art style would probably fit for that, because I think that could work really well. They've made it work with Majora's Mask, even though they didn't really have the freedom of art style, because it was still a new system in a new age when 3D was still relatively new. And, it needs to be darker, I think. The whole story in general needs to be darker. People really enjoy that. And you might be thinking it's like a mainstream thought to think that way because, fuck, if you've ever been on Reddit or anyone, they'll tell you how good Majora's Mask is and nothing else. But that's not necessarily a reason to say no to a darker story just because everyone wants it. I think because everyone wants it, we probably should give it another go. At least once. I mean, don't do it over and over, but give it a go. See what you can do. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen because Nintendo wants to market more to a wider audience, which is a whole other video entirely again. Same with the multiplayer thing I was talking about earlier. They want to market to a wider audience, and a sadder, darker, more intense story probably wouldn't work well for a wide audience. At least they don't think it would work well. and that's a bummer because they're probably going to go for another Skyward Sword-y type story, in that it's going to be right in the middle. A very not, I guess these are just all guesses by me, but I'm pretty sure that, I mean, I'd be more than happy if they surprised me, but I'm pretty sure the story is going to be similar to Skyward Sword, and it's not going to be overly dark or overly happy. It's going to be somewhere in the middle and somewhere probably in a bland spot, unfortunately. But I hope they, if they surprise me, I will be happy. I'm not saying that, that I don't want them to do it. That's what I think is going to happen, and that's unfortunate. But we'll see. We'll see. I don't know if they're going to say anything at E3 this year. I hope they do, but it's from what the video I also saw is that they said it's taking longer than they thought, or it's taking a long time, which probably means we're probably not going to see this game for at least another 2 years. That might be a little long for at least amount, but they always take their time with Zelda games. So Skyward Sword just came out last year, or I guess 2 years ago now, but a year and 2 months ago. There you go. That's Skyward Sword took 5 years to make. So we could be out another 3.5 years even, which would be really sad. But anyway, next point I wanted to make is about the bosses. This kind of goes again with the dungeons thing, but the bosses need to be more epic. We look at the bosses in Skyward Sword. You had Girahim. I hated him. I hated his character. I hated his fights. Oh no to Girahim. And you fought that fucker 3 times. 3 times. He replaced 2 dungeon bosses, which could have been themed and cool and worked together with their respective dungeons, but no, he was there twice. Fucking obnoxious. And then he fought his final fight, which I guess makes sense. I don't have a problem with that, but seriously, he took up 2 dungeon fights. Such a terrible decision by Nintendo. He could have had, I don't know, like the first boss, Twilight Princess, was a giant fucking poisonous flower monster thing. It was awesome. It was kind of like the first Metroid Prime boss, the giant plant thing. It was cool. It fit the dungeon too. The dungeon was like a poison swamp forest thing, and it worked. First boss of Skyward Sword was Girahim, where you did a stupid sword fight with wonky controls, and it was bleh. Boss fights in Zelda need to be epic, like they were in Ocarina of Time. I'm probably gonna reference Ocarina of Time every 2 seconds, but yeah, all the bosses were awesome. The first boss you fought was a giant spider bug monster. Second boss was a giant lizard beast. The third was a fucking parasite inside of a body. You see where I'm going here? They were creative and cool. Skyward Sword, the second boss was okay. The mechanics of the fight were kind of lame, but the boss itself was cool-ish. It was just a giant lava rock. Not even a giant, like a medium-sized lava rock. Okay, maybe it wasn't that good. I'm trying to convince myself that it was good, but I don't think it was that good. It was average at best. The third fight was horrible. It was just a scorpion. Another medium-sized scorpion boss that was a gimmick to the sword play where all you had to do was slash its stupid claws. They even reused it as a mini-boss later on in the game. That's how lame that boss was. They reused it as a mini-boss. The same fucking boss. What the fuck? And then the next boss was Moop, Scoops, and Duty. What was the next boss? You go into the Ancient Cistern. Oh, that was probably one of the only good bosses. The Ancient Cistern, the Koluptos, Automaton. Fucking awesome boss. One of the best bosses ever. More bosses like that guy. More bosses where the fight feels epic. It wasn't even necessarily difficult, but it felt amazing. You ripped the dude's arms off. You picked up his own weapon and beat the shit out of him with it. It was awesome. And again, you can do even better than that, probably. I mean, even when it comes down to it, that boss fight wasn't that complicated, but it still felt awesome. That's what I mean, that you could have a simple fight, but still make it feel cool. And then the next boss was fucking Tantalus. I'm level with you here. Tantalus is the largest boss in Zelda history. If I remember, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure largest boss in any Zelda game. It is also the stupidest and most ridiculous looking boss in any Zelda game. This is how, just because a boss is big doesn't mean it's good kind of scenario, whatever. It looked like a fucking monster out of Monsters Incorporated, the Pixar film. It was laughable. Like, they built up the fight so well, too. Like, you go into the bottom of a ship, it starts all you see is tentacles smashing through the floor, and the whole thing's, like, flooding, and you're running through. It was an awesome... The first part of the fight is awesome. You're not even fighting the damn thing. My computer is, going dead. There we go. You're not even fighting the guy, and that was the best part of the fight. The part where you're just running from it. And then you get it, and he pops out of the water, and I fucking laughed at it. That's how bad it was. I laughed at it. And it was like, just, why? Why would you make it so goofy looking? Anyway, the bosses need to be... I need to be intimidated by the boss. I can't be laughing at it the whole time. It's the same problem with one of the later boss fights, Byleth's Sight. It was a cool concept in that you were flying around and you had to land on a giant fish thing and kill a parasite, but it looked goofy. It looked funny. It was silly. The bosses need to be intimidating. That's why they're bosses. That's why they're even called bosses in the first place. They need to be intimidating. And Skyward Sword, again, they weren't. I wasn't intimidated by Girahim because all he would do is walk up slowly to you or stand back and throw tiny crystals at you. You could easily counter. It wasn't intimidating at all. The bosses need to be better. Just, there you go. I know that sounds really simple and stupid, but that's just the truth about it. The bosses are a very core, important part of Zelda, and you can't slack on that. Same thing with the I'm kind of just repetitively bashing on Skyward Sword, but I'm using it as a what not to do example. I'm using Ocarina of Time as a what to do example here. But Skyward Sword, or the Imprisoned, I mean, looked goofy. He was actually, I mean, spoilers, by the way, since I'm actually probably getting a little spoilerish now. The Imprisoned was the final boss of the game in a way. Even though you fight him in a different form, he's still technically the final boss. And he looks hysterical. He's goofy and stupid. And the fight is just, you slash at his toes a little bit and he falls over like a goofy, clumsy little thing. And you beat his head. It's silly. It was just silly. And fights should be terrifying, like Bongo Bongo from the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time. A fucking decapitated, monstrous, disfigured dead guy where an eyeball grew out of his neck, and his hands are fucking dilapidated and flying around, banging on a giant-ass drum, which is the entire stage of the fight. Fucking... what? More bosses like those. Please. I'm just gonna... That's a good one. That's a good boss. Anyway, enough about bosses. I already talked about how the game needs to be darker. Let's talk about the items a little bit. The items are another main feature of the game in that they're how you move around. They're supposed to be how you interact with enemies in combat, and they generally all provide their special little thing in the game. I guess in every game in Zelda, maybe except the Wind Waker, has gotten the items right, except for Skyward Sword. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but let's see. In Ocarina of Time, you had a lot of items from Link to the Past, but you had all the Din's Fire, Nehru's Love, Farore's Wind. Even though the hook shot is from, again, Link to the Past, they made it look cooler, and you had the long shot upgraded that. Again, that's the problem, though, is that we were starting to recycle the items so much. But again, at the time, Ocarina of Time had only done it once, so it wasn't a big deal. Not counting the first Zelda game, Zelda. But the item, it was okay to recycle them again because it was in 3D, and they had to reinvent the items to have them work in 3D, so that was okay. In Majora's Mask, you had, I think, all the same items, unfortunately, but the key point is that you had the masks, especially the transformation masks. Every mask had its unique, had a unique effect, and acted as its own kind of little item. So there were a massive amount of items in Majora's Mask, even though most of them were reused in the technical item screen. So that's why Majora's Mask was okay. Wind Waker kind of goofed a little bit in that they really didn't have very many new items besides the Deku Leaf. Is that the only new item? Actually, come to think of it, you didn't have much in Wind Waker in terms of items, and that's why the Wind Waker kind of felt a little lacking in the item department. But then in Twilight Princess, you had the the wrecking ball, you had the spinner. The spinner is fucking awesome. Not very useful, but just really cool of an item, especially how it's used in the dungeon itself and in the fight of that dungeon. The spinner is just cool. You had bomb arrows, even though those are just two different items put together. It's still a cool reimagining of the item. You had the double claw shot, which is again an item that already exists as the hook shot, but they reinvented it and made it cool and different. That's good, but then you have Skyward Sword that comes in, and we have very, very few items in Skyward Sword for some reason. I don't know why. There's so very little, and barely any of them are even useful. You have, in terms of new items, the Gust Bellows. Literally, it's just a gimmick. Its only use in the entire game is to get through that specific dungeon that you collect the item in. And other than that, you can clean some lady's house with it. It literally just blows air. It's a goddamn hairdryer. That's all it is. Fuck. A terrible item. You had the whip, which I think was actually from old Zelda games. I'm not sure which. It might be Link to the Past. Was there a whip in Link to the Past? I don't think there was. What was the whip? I don't know. The whip was just, it was another gimmicky item. It was just used to get through the dungeon. None of the items in Skyward Sword had any kind of use in combat. Not even the bow. The bow, which is very useful in other games in combat. It's so clunky and hard to use because of the poor motion controls that there's no reason to use it. Your sword is way better anyway, even though that also has its problems. So, arrows didn't work, and there was, what else was there? I'm trying to remember. You had the double claw shot, which is basically, they didn't reimagine the claw shot at all. They just reused it from Twilight Princess. And, I think you had the slingshot, which is, again, exactly the same. No new item there. So, I know I'm forgetting a couple, but that's because they so weren't memorable at all that I can't remember them. It's kind of sad. I could sit here and try to remember them, but I know they're not going to be very exciting. So, anyway, that's what happens when you don't have, same thing with Maker, that's what happens when you don't put enough effort into the items. The next Zelda game needs to have more like Twilight Princess, different, brand new items. Never before seen items. I feel like I'm advertising something here. But, hit my desk. There needs to be new items. And again, you can have old items. In fact, I guarantee they'll have a bow and arrow, and they'll have, they'll have the hook shot and the bow and arrow. I guarantee you the next game's going to have that, because they're two great items for all the Zelda games, even though Skyward Sword used them so poorly. But they need to reimagine those items. Make them a little different. Ocarina of Time reimagined them, gave them fire arrows and ice arrows and light arrows. I'm trying to think right now. There needs to be, you can have the old items, and if you want, you can have all the old items. I don't care. They're all good items, but you need to have something more there, or it's gonna feel empty. And they need to be useful in combat too. The boomerang was crazy useful in Wind Waker as a combat item. So was the hammer, and you could even use the grappling hook to steal items off of enemies in Wind Waker 2 while you're fighting them. It fucking makes sense. It's nice. In Skyward Sword, you only used your sword. Literally, you only used your sword. 98% of the fights in that game, not counting when you need the item to beat the boss, you only use your sword, and it gets old quick. Next game needs to make sure that doesn't happen. Don't focus on the sword so much. Focus more on the items. Make them fun to use, because they were always fun to use in old games. Skyward Sword, they weren't fun to use. I guess this is one thing I'll talk about Skyward Sword that's a good thing, as my next point, is the upgrade system in Skyward Sword. Really cool idea. It needs to be expanded upon because it was kind of, I don't want to say useless, but it really held no major point, but it was still a great idea and needs to be improved upon. I don't want to turn Zelda into a full-fledged RPG. We don't want that. But make it to where the items or the upgrades matter. And then people will want to get rupees to get the upgrades because they matter. Don't make them necessary, but make them matter. Because that would make rupees matter. Rupees never matter in Zelda games as opposed to the fucking Triforce chart deciphering in Wind Waker, which is just a rupee dump and a time sink. They didn't matter in any other games because you always had enough rupees to get what you needed for the story. There was just nothing to burn your rupees on, so you always had a bunch of fucking rupees that you couldn't spend it on. Skyward Sword, it step in the right direction. There were a lot of things to spend rupees on, and they were all expensive. So when you never felt like you were just hoarding this mass amount of rupees that you didn't need. So it worked. But it needs to be expanded upon because it still felt like, even though I could buy all these things, none of them did anything. If I were to play through the game again, I probably would have a bunch of rupees because I would know not to buy the things I didn't need. I wouldn't need to upgrade anything. I wouldn't need to do any of that. It would be a waste of time. So I probably would have all those rupees again. So again, step in the right direction. Needs to be expanded upon a little better. Moving on, these are smaller points, I guess. I already talked about a lot of the main points. A more likable companion. I wrote that down. Midna is probably the best. This is an opinion thing, but Midna was a really good companion in that she had a likable character, and she didn't interrupt you every fucking 2 seconds. But she still had a point. She was still part of the game. She spoke and she did things. King of Red Lions and Wind Waker was a great companion, but he very rarely said anything or had a part in the story until the very end, or at least the general end. When you spoiler alert, when you find out that he was your boat the whole time, or that, the boat was the King of Red Lions. Anyway, or the old King of Hyrule. So that was a fail. Navi was just fucking annoying, even though she was, she probably could have been likable if she didn't fucking bother you every 2 seconds. But then there's Tattle in Majora's Mask, who probably better than Navi, but not as good as Midna in that she had a part in the story, but again, she bothered you not as much as Navi, but still a little bit. I mean, her character wasn't likable. She was a bitch. She was a fucking bitch. Or was it a he? I can never remember. I hate it. She was always being an asshole. Even at the very end of the game. The very, very end of the game. At the epic point when she's like, I don't fucking help you. I'm scared. I'm gonna stay here. It was like, seriously? After all we've been through, you're just gonna cop the fuck out? Fuck you. So she wasn't likable. And it hurt that she wasn't a good companion for that reason. But the new game needs to have a companion that, I could sit here and talk about Fi, Faux Fum, fuck her, not likable, obnoxious, all the wrong things of the other companions, all put into one little package for you. Horrible companion. The next companion needs to be likable, needs to be part of the story, and needs to be out of your face for the right amount of time. She can give you helpful hints. She could pop up at the beginning of a new area or explain, that's okay about Fi. She pops up and tells you about the area when you get there for the first time, but she pops up every time something happens. Every time there's a cutscene, she needs to put her 2 cents in, and that gets old quick. Even if she was likable, it still would have been terrible because of how fucking annoying or how many times she popped up. The next companion needs to be, not that. Everything that Fi isn't is what the next companion needs to be. The exact opposite, and you'll have yourself a great companion. This one I put in all caps because I'm very adamant about it, even though I know it's not probably going to be done. Less tutorial bullshit. I mean, it takes a good hour, maybe even a good hour and a half to actually start Skyward Sword and to start getting the ball rolling and playing the game. There's literally 38 minutes, that's not an exaggeration, 38 minutes of cutscenes before you even get your clothes. Yeah. That's a lot of cutscenes, dude. That's too much. And a majority of it is tutorials. The majority of it is just hand-holding and story, too much story. And it needs to be less of it. The next game needs to have just either, if you want to have your tutorial, you can put it there, but let me skip it, or make it, I don't want to say out of the way, because people who, need it, probably need to know it's there, but make it very easily skippable, and don't make it too painful to skip, don't break the immersion to let you skip it. Just make sure it's there and neatly designed to be easily skippable, so literally I can skip over it daintily. I don't want it. And even farther into the game, it's like the beauty about Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess is that when you got a new item, the game told you in a text box very quickly what the item did, and then the game learnt you on that item. It learned you some. It puts you in a room that you were probably locked in and had to use the item to get out of in a very simple manner. It's nice. It's really good. You got, and you immediately knew how to use the item, even though, I mean, it told you what button to press, and it told you kind of what the item did, but then it showed you. It showed you and let you figure it out yourself. You know, you fucking throw the boomerang and hit the switch, fucking, yeah, it's boomerang, hit switches. I got it, good. It gives you more challenging puzzles afterwards, and it makes you feel like you're learning the item and using the item properly. Skyward Sword, fucking, you get the item, you add the little text box, then 5 pops up and tells you what the item does again for some reason. Then you do the puzzle. It's like, okay, do I even need the puzzle now that you've told me literally everything the item does in detail? Just let me out of the room now. I don't even want to fucking do it. And it's bad. The tutorial, the hand holding needs to stop. That doesn't even necessarily mean the game needs to be hard. I hope it's hard, but it doesn't need to be. It just, don't tell me. Literally, I've mentioned this before in the Skyward Sword video that I did, but in Skyward Sword there's a puzzle that is presented to you, and then you are promptly told how to solve it. After it shows you, it hints at you how to beat it, and then it literally tells you how to do it. It's like, are you seriously, guys? Seriously? It's not even that hard. It wasn't even that hard of a puzzle, but at least it was a hard enough puzzle to be satisfying for doing it. But then they take away the satisfaction by fucking... It's like, no. No. The next game, none of that nonsense. Even though I'm pretty sure it's going to have it, because Nintendo, again, wants to cater to a wider audience, which is the main problem theme here throughout why I'm worried about the next game. Two more points I'm going to make here. The next one is a filled overworld. No Zelda game has gotten this quite right yet. I would say Majora's Mask probably got it the closest, but even though, because the overworld was tiny in that game, but the overworld needs to have a point. In Wind Waker, the overworld was the ocean, and while it had a very bumpin' theme, it's very empty, and all the things that you can do don't really have a point. In the very end, all you're going to get from doing a majority of the extra overworld content is probably rupees, and once you have all the Triforce charts done, you don't need rupees anyway. So, I mean, it's like, it didn't work. And Twilight Princess, it was okay. It was smaller than Wind Waker. It still didn't have much. There were heart pieces hidden around in secret caves that probably had heart pieces. That's about it, though. Didn't have much. It felt empty, but, you know, the game at least didn't really force you to be in the overworld that much, because you had teleport. You could teleport from different points, and you never really need to be in the overworld. So that was all right. But Ocarina of Time, the overworld was very empty. That was probably just limitations to the hardware at that point, though, so not really its fault. But Skyward Sword had the sky, which literally was empty. Nothing but goddess chests. Nothing. There was like 2 mini games, and that's it. Nothing else. And that made it to where it was like, why would I even bother? I mean, literally, there are islands that are just perfect circles, like 20 feet across, with a chest in the middle. That's it. It's like, you guys did not put a lot of work into this, or you didn't put enough work. The overworld needs to have a point, and it leads into the next point, which I'm going to make, in that there needs to be side quests in that overworld, or in the whole game, that need to be meaningful. I'm going to point my finger very broadly and painfully obviously at Majora's Mask, because that game got that shit right. And it got it right good. It got it right good. All of the side... I mean, that's kind of unfair to weight it with other games, because Majora's Mask was focused on the side quests, maybe even more than the main quest itself. But still, just because that's the way that was, doesn't mean it has to be that way for every game that wants to have side quests. You can focus just as much on the side quests as you can on the main quest, and still be good. But in Skyward Sword, every side quest, literally, this is not an exaggeration under any circumstance, is a fetch quest. You go pick up an item, and you bring it to a point. no attempt to make it seem like you're actually doing anything important. You were just picking up an item and taking it to a point. Sometimes you take it to 2 points. Totally terrible side quests. Completely pointless. They didn't even have an impact in a story manner. I mean, you had the demon guy who you brought the shit to, who wanted to beat. I don't remember it because it wasn't even meaningful. In Majora's Mask, my computer's going dead again. In Majora's Mask, you had a side quest where, again, you are actually just going and getting things and bringing things to points, but the game disguises it and makes it meaningful. The entire Anju and Cafe side quest is so impactful, all up to the climax of that fucking scene where you're sitting there as the world is ending, talking to two people who get married in front of you and then die. They don't actually die, but it's implied that they stay together and die, and they wanted to be with each other for their last moments and die together. Whoa. Whoa, that's side quest right there. That's a fucking side quest. If that were the main quest, I'd be satisfied. That's what side quests need to be like. They need to feel like there's a meaning behind them and that I want to do them, and not that I have to go pick up goddamn medicine for someone and bring it back to them on a stupid random item somewhere. Island. Fucking... More side quests like those. Seriously. So that's all I had on the checklist. I've got through all of it. And real quick, I'm going to throw this in here at the end because it might turn into a rant. But I said I didn't want to talk about it, but I want to talk about it now. They said they wanted to rethink the fact that Zelda was single player. Now, I want to frame my argument very, very well here, because I think this is really important. I think it's more important than others will give it credit for. Multiplayer in games is a good thing for a vast majority of games. Almost every game, multiplayer can be construed as a good idea. Zelda? Not a good idea. And, I mean, you can look at Four Swords and see why. Four Swords is a great game. It's a fun game. It's Zelda, but it's not Zelda. I mean, you're gonna get 1/5 of the Zelda experience out of Four Swords than you will out of, say, Majora's Mask or Wind Waker or Twilight or any other Zelda game. Even Link to the Past. You're gonna get it's a random number, but it's generally what my point remains the same. You're gonna get a much less experience out of that game. And it's just because of the fact that it's multiplayer. It's a gimmick in that game. It's just it's not a bad gimmick, but it's still a gimmick in that game. And I can only see multiplayer working in one way for the new Zelda game. And I think it would work. And that you would have to make it the main story. It would have to be that there are not two Links, but Link and another person that can be played as a character. And then that problem with that though is that you'll split the game into single player and multiplayer. Single player will have the game without that companion, or that companion controlled by an AI, and God forbid, we know that AI in games that are your partner are fucking awful a lot of the time and useless and makes you hate them, and that's bad. You don't want that. You don't want an AI companion that'll follow you around and bug the shit out of you and be obnoxious and not work the way you want it to. And that's going to be unfortunate for people who want to play the game single player. There might be ways around it. I'm not a game designer. I don't know what they're thinking here. This is all presumptuous, but still, I can only see this working in very few, maybe even only one way in that way. I mean, you have the other way they would do it, in which you would have the single player, and you'd have a separate multiplayer, which would just be completely different, and a different part of the game. But who are you trying to target here with this multiplayer? I mean, you're not going to target competitive audiences, because what are you going to have as a competitive Zelda multiplayer game? Not much. Sword combat? That could be fun for like in a Wii Sports kind of way, in that you play it a couple times and then you're tired of it and it's over. it doesn't bring the kind of replayability that a competitive game like Team Fortress 2 or any other multiplayer game like Dota would. You wouldn't have that draw to come back and be like, I want to play this again because I like to win this. This is fun to win. It's fun to play and be in part of the competition. I don't see you doing that with the Zelda game. You'd have a fun multiplayer, which would be more centered to just being fun to play, like a Mario Party kind of Super Smash Brothers way, which might work, but is it necessary? I mean, is it really necessary to have that in a Zelda game when Nintendo already has so many fun multiplayer games? I mean, Nintendo fucking corners the market on purely fun, non-competitive multiplayer games. Nintendo has that shit locked down. Do we really need another one? Do we need a team dedicated to not spending time on the single player and spending time on the multiplayer of a game when Nintendo has already proved that even with everyone working on the single player of Skyward Sword, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it well. These are all my opinions. I'd absolutely love to hear what you guys think in the comments. That's the whole point of this. If this is the first time you're listening to one of these, go write a comment. I'll read it. If you want to start a discussion, I'll discuss with you. But whenever I hear multiplayer, red flags, nothing but red flags in my head. And I'm still trying to figure it out and see how it would be a positive thing. But I can't see it. All I'm getting are red flags. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. But, I look at multiplayer in games that didn't have multiplayer before. The first game that comes to mind is Metroid Prime. And we all know how that turned out in Metroid Prime 2. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be that way. I'm not saying it would be anywhere close to that, but that's what I'm going off of here in terms of, Zelda is an immersive experience that's meant to be a story. It's meant to be fun to play single player, and it's meant to be an experience. I said that. I'm going to repeat that. It's meant to be an experience that you go through and that just feels fluid and fun and immersive. A multiplayer aspect to Zelda just doesn't make sense. There's no reason to do it other than to try and corner a market that doesn't already play Zelda. And that is shallow to everyone else who wants to play Zelda. I have my opinion. I think this is a shared opinion. I haven't asked anyone else. I've only argued with Cameron and Green, but I don't know what the whole Zelda fan group thinks about this. I think that they all would hate it. That's my general is that I think no one wants this at all. And I might be completely wrong, but that's what the first thing that comes to my head is that nobody wants this. Nobody who is a fan of Zelda wants this. I'm going to have to look into that. I don't know. I haven't looked anywhere. I could be completely wrong. And if I'm wrong, I'll accept that, but that's just what I think. And that's probably going to be the end of the video. So, this is all meant to be a discussion. Post your comments down below. I'll read every single one of them, and I'll respond to most of them, as long as you direct them at me in the form of a conversation, then I will conversate back with you. But anyway, this is another nearly 15-minute Zelda video. I can talk about Zelda for a long time. I love that game. I love the series. It's the only reason I make a video like this, and I make it sound like I'm hating on the games, but that's because I love them so much. I want them to be good. I want them to be perfect. It's just the way I want them to be. But we'll see. We will see. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.